The warning was written 4 years ago. Nobody listened. Now a forwarder. 3 million engine was dying in the street, and the man who designed it was watching from the sidewalk. Worn jacket, torn backpack, 3 years without an address, 47 minutes left. The billionaire had already called security. What nobody in that crowd understood, what nobody could have understood, was that the homeless man standing 8 feet from the car knew something the manufacturer didn't, something the engineers didn't, something that had been documented, filed, and buried before this car ever existed. He had written the warning himself. They took his name off it anyway. Nobody looked at him twice. That was the thing about disappearing. It did not happen all at once. It happened in sequences, each one small enough to absorb, until the total distance from visible to invisible was so large that even the man it happened to had stopped being surprised by it. Elroy Webb woke at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning in October, in the gap between a broken fence and the east wall of an abandoned machine shop on Carver Street. He had chosen this spot 11 months ago for 3 reasons. The broken fence section faced away from the prevailing wind. The drainage channel south, which meant rain moved away from him rather than toward him. And the overnight security guard from the bolt factory next door turned around at the same corner every night. Never past it, always at it, reliable as a clock. Elroy knew this because he had watched for 4 nights before he stayed. He sat up, reached for the tarp, folded it along the same 4 creases as every morning, pressed each fold flat with the heel of his hand, and set it at the bottom of the backpack. Then the thin thermal layer. Then the spare shirt wrapped around the water bottle. Everything in sequence. Everything in its place. The notebook went in last, on top. Always on top. It was a composition book, originally black and white, now mostly gray from handling. The cover had separated at the spine and been reattached with electrical tape he had found in a recycling bin outside a hardware supplier on Meridian Avenue. The pages inside were dense with small handwriting. Equations, material specifications, cross-sections of systems that existed only in his mind, drawn in cell on whatever surface had been available. Some pages were newsprint from discarded papers. Some were the backs of shelter meal schedules. Some statistics of technical journals he had pulled from the recycling bins outside Nexus Tech's side entrance on Hamilton Avenue, where the engineering staff discarded their reading on Fridays. He walked to the public restroom 2 blocks east, washed his face, brushed his teeth, ran a comb through his hair. A small comb, black, kept in the left chest pocket of his jacket where it had lived for 2 years. Then he walked to the library. 2 miles. He knew every crack in the sidewalk between the machine shop and the Carver Street Public Library. Which squares were raised enough to catch a heel in the dark. Which corner smelled like burnt butter at 6:30, because the bakery on the ground floor of the Hewitt building started their first batch at 6:15. Which block the city had repaved last spring with the slightly lighter concrete that still looked new. And one they had been promising to fix for 4 years without touching. The library opened at 7. He arrived at 6:55, sat on the steps. He liked those 5 minutes. The city had not yet fully committed to being loud. He could think without working around the noise. At 7, the doors opened. He went in, nodded to the reference desk librarian, a man named Gerald, who had worked the morning shift for what appeared to be the entirety of recorded history, and who had over time stopped reacting to Elroy's arrival with anything other than a nod back. He read for 2 hours. Whatever was on the returns cart, plus whatever came through the morning drop-off slot. And on Tuesdays and Fridays, he walked to the recycling bins on Hamilton Avenue before the library opened and checked for journals. The engineering staff at Nexus Tech were consistent. Thermal Systems Quarterly. Applied Materials Review. The Journal of Quantum Engineering, which had started publishing 18 months ago, and which had already become the most useful thing he read regularly. He did not read these journals out of nostalgia for a previous life. He read them because his was still working and needed material. 3 evenings a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, he taught at Shelter Westside, Room 4B, 6 to 8 in the evening. A folding table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with a marker that was always nearly gone, but never quite empty. His students were 3 people who had arrived at their present circumstances through entirely different routes, and shared the same result. Raymond was 53, former hospital electrician, licensed for 22 years, until a seizure disorder diagnosis at 51 led to a treatment period of his savings, his apartment, and his professional license in that order. He had applied for reinstatement twice. Both times the application had been rejected on the basis of his medical history. Both times the rejection had been technically legal. D was 38. She had written risk modeling software for a regional bank for 9 years, until the bank was acquired by a larger institution that dissolved her department during the consolidation. The severance was 4 months. The job search took longer than 4 months. The gap between those two facts was where everything else had unraveled. Lena was 61. She had worked as a home health aide for 2 decades, gone back to school for nursing at 57, with the specific and careful calculated intention of working a final decade in a better-paying role before retirement. She had passed her boards on the first attempt. She had then been able to obtain hospital employment because a dismissed but drug charge from 1994. Possession, misdemeanor, thrown out. Kept appearing in background checks despite a court order to seal the record. 3 people. 3 different stories. The same wall at the end of each one. Elroy taught them the physics that lived in the room around them. The thermal dynamics of why the shelter's radiator pipes banged in winter. Expansion in a closed system, pressure relief at the joints, exactly the same symbol that governed every cooling system he had ever designed, just at a different scale with different materials. The load distribution in the ceiling joists, which Raymond could identify on site, and which became a 40-minute conversation about stress vectors that none of them had planned, and all of them were reluctant to end. The electrical resistance calculations that Lena, to everyone's mild surprise, including her own, absorbed faster than either of the others. He taught because he could, because they wanted to learn, because the room on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings was the one place where his knowledge had an unambiguous use, subsistence that received it without intention. He had not always had reason to think carefully about the value of that. Now he did. Here is what people who have never been homeless do not understand about it. It is not one disaster. It is not one catastrophic decision at a fork in the road where a different choice would have led somewhere better. It is not a character flaw made visible. It is a sequence of ordinary system failures, each individually defensible, each makes perfect administrative sense, that combined to produce an outcome the system was not designed to acknowledge as its own fault. Elroy could draw the diagram. He had, in fact, drawn it once in the notebook on a page between 2 thermal dynamics calculations. He had drawn it partly as an exercise in understanding, and partly because drawing the diagram was the only way to confirm that the thing was real, and to search not a series of coincidences that added up to something that felt like design, but was actually just bad luck accumulating. It was not bad luck accumulating. 5 years ago, he was lead thermal engineering consultant at Aerotech Industries, working on the Helios quantum thrust cooling system, the engine architecture that would eventually sell in 17 production vehicles, each priced above $4 million, and each described, in the marketing materials, as a feat of proprietary engineering innovation. He had 3 degrees from MIT, the first at 22, the second at 24. The third at 26, completed while he was already working. 7 patents with his name as primary inventor, all filed through legitimate process, all generating licensing revenue for the companies that had employed him when he made the relevant discoveries. He had a co-op apartment in the Millbrook district, a parking space in the building's underground structure, a dry cleaning account, a dentist he had been seeing for 4 years who knew his name when he walked in. He was, by the measurement the people used to assess as whether a maze one is doing what it's supposed to be. He's doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Then he wrote a safety report. Internal Memo XT 447, 14 pages. Technical language, exact and unadorned, the way he wrote everything. The secondary cooling loop in the Helios system had a structural vulnerability at the convergence point where it met the tertiary chamber junction. The geometry of that junction, under sustained high-pressure operation at peak thermal load, created conditions for microfracturing. Not possible, not eventual, probable. He had modeled it 6 ways with different starting parameters each time. The same result at the end of each model. He flagged it red. He marked the relevant section of the engineering diagram with a double border and a note that read, Cricketog. Requires design review before production authorization. He presented it in person to the engineering review board. 3 senior managers, 1 VP of product development, and Gordon Ashby, deputy president of commercial operations, sitting at the head of the table. Ashby was 53 at the time, with the kind of face that had become authoritative through decades of practice. Strong jaw, gray at the temples, eyes that zigged through a room assessing rather than seeing. He wore his suits the way people wear things that have long since stopped requiring attention. He had been at Aerotech for 19 years and had reached the position he occupied by being, among other things, genuinely good at reading which way a meeting was going to go before anyone else in the room had worked it out. When Elroy walked in and set up his materials, Ashby was already looking at the summary of the memo. He had read it before the meeting. His expression was the expression of a man who had decided the outcome before the question was asked. Elroy presented. Anyway, 14 pages, 40 minutes, questions taken. He answered each question with the patience he applied to all technical problems. Thorough, without condescension, willing to go back to first principles when the question required it. The launch timeline was 8 weeks out. Addressing the secondary loop vulnerability would require retooling the convergence junction. 6 weeks of work, minimum, which pushed the launch to 14 weeks, which triggered penalty clauses in 2 of the 17 pre-order contracts, which created a financial exposure that Elroy had calculated and included in the memo on page 11, alongside the projected liability of proceeding without the redesign. The decision took 11 minutes after he left the room. The memo was filed. The launch timeline was maintained. Elroy was told that his concerns had been noted and that the engineering team had full confidence in the existing design. He asked for the decision in writing. He received an email acknowledging his presentation. It did not address the technical substance. It thanked him for his thoroughness. He kept the email. He kept copies of everything. It was a habit from his first engineering supervisors, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had told him on his first day in a professional lab. Always keep the original, not a copy. The original with the original timestamp in a format that cannot be edited without detection, because the day will come when the record matters more than the memory. He had understood at 23 what specific situations she was preparing him for. 2 years after the review board meeting, a prototype unit failed during a closed demonstration. The secondary cooling loop fractured at the convergence junction, exactly where Elroy had predicted. The failure mode followed exactly the sequence he had modeled. Nobody was physically injured, though one of the observers sustained a minor burn from vapor contact. The financial damage was significant. The reputational damage was worse, given the exclusivity of the audience and the price point of the product. Aerotech needed someone to be responsible for the failure of a systems that had been internally flagged and approved over objection. The internal investigation lasted 6 weeks. It produced a report. The report concluded that the lead technical consultant, since had submitted incomplete safety analysis, had failed to communicate risk clearly and adequately to the review board. Elroy read the report and recognized almost nothing in it. His memo had been complete. His communication at the review board had been direct, detailed, and on record. The report's conclusions contradicted the documented facts at multiple specific points. He obtained, through a contact at Aerotech, who owed him a professional courtesy, access to the digital record of the original memo XT447 as it existed in the company's document management system. The version in the system was different from the version he had submitted. Not substantially different. Not rewritten. Changed at precisely the points that mattered. The risk classification altered from red to yellow. The timeline recommendation removed from the summary section. The financial liability projection on page 11 reduced by a factor that made it look manageable rather than serious. The changes were small enough to be deniable individually. Together, they transformed the document from a clear warning into something that could be read as a qualified concern. The timestamp on the document showed it had been last modified 11 days after Elroy's termination. He had the original, timestamped, on a USB drive he had kept in the inner pocket of his jacket since the day he submitted the memo because he had understood. Not with certainty, but with the professional instinct of someone who had been in enough review board meetings to know which the wind was blowing, that the original might eventually be the only accurate record of what had actually said. He took the USB drive to a lawyer. The lawyer was thorough. She reviewed the original and the modified version side by side, pulling both files up on separate monitors and going through them section by section. She was visibly troubled by what she saw. At the end of the consultation, she gave him the number, $80,000. Retainer plus anticipated filing costs plus expert witness fees, estimated conservatively on the assumption that Aerotech would contest every stage of discovery. Elroy had $412 in his checking account. A credit card with a $2,000 limit carrying a balance he had been paying minimums on since the unemployment insurance ran out, which had happened faster than expected because the initial claim had been rejected on a technicality related to the terms of his separation agreement, and the appeal had taken 4 months to process, and then partially succeeded in a way that was technically a victory and practically too late. He thanked the lawyer, shook her hand, walked out. He sat on the steps outside her building for a long time, not frozen, thinking, trying to map the path from where he was to where he needed to be, and the path kept failing at the same point. No permanent address meant no bank account. No bank account meant no ability to receive the kind of payment transfer that would let him accumulate enough to pay a retainer. No credit history at a fixed address meant the 2 banks he subsequently approached declined to open an account. And without being able to receive funds reliably, there was no mechanism for rebuilding the financial position that would make legal action possible. Each barrier was a policy. Each policy had a reason. None of the reasons were malicious. Together they formed a wall with no gate in it. The apartment came next. Then the car when he could no longer maintain payments or insurance. Then the storage unit when he could no longer cover that fee either. He kept the notebook, the pencils, the USB drive, the emergency repair kit he had carried since his 3rd year at Aerotech, because Dr. Patricia Osei had also told him on a different day and in a different context. A real engineer can work the problem in front of them with what is in arm's reach. Don't wait for perfect conditions. There are no perfect conditions. He kept the habit of thinking. And on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings, he stood in front of a whiteboard in room 4B at Shelter West Side and taught 3 people what he knew about how the physical world worked, using the objects in the room around them, because that was the only equipment available, and also because it was he had found the best way to teach anything, starting with what people could already touch. The morning it happened was a Tuesday, October. The sky was flat and gray in the way that October mornings in the city produce. Not dramatic, not threatening, just present. A working day sky, committed to neither sunshine nor rain, simply providing light. Elroy had his coffee. The church on 5th Street opened its doors at 6:30 for exactly the purpose of providing hot coffee and a warm interior to people who needed both, without condition or documentation required. and was cutting through the industrial district on the way back from his library session. He had found a copy of Thermal Systems Quarterly in the recycling bins on Hamilton Avenue that morning. 2 issues, one of which contained a paper on microchannel cooling architecture that connected, in a way he was still working out, to the 3rd idea in the notebook. He was thinking about that connection when he heard the engine. The Helios Apex at idle has a specific sound, low harmonic, sustained, the particular quality of controlled power that has nothing to prove and is not trying to. Elroy had spent 14 months in prototype testing environment at Aerotech, listening to early versions of this engine, listening for variations, for anomalies, for the small auditory evidence of systems under stress. He knew what its sound died like when it was working correctly. This one was not working correctly. The variation was subtle. 3 beats in approximately every 40 where the timing was fractionally off. A catch barely perceptible in the secondary cooling cycle. The pressure regulation was compensating for something it should not have needed to compensate for. And the compensation was creating a micro-variation in the system's rhythm at a frequency low enough that the vast majority of people within earshot would register it as a perfectly healthy engine. Elroy was not the vast majority of people within earshot. He slowed his pace, looked up. The car was parked at the curb on Meridian Avenue, outside the glass frontage of a marketing consultancy. Slate gray, low-slung, the intake integrated into the undercarriage, rather than a front panel, because the Helios had no conventional grille. The thermal management was handled differently, by a system that Elroy had spent 14 months helping design before anyone called it the Helios or put a price tag on it, one of 17 in production. He knew the budget because the 17 pre-order contracts had been a central data point in page 11 of Memo XT447, the page where he had laid out the financial comparison between proceeding with the flaw and addressing it. From the forward right vent panel, a thread of vapor, blue-gray, faintly iridescent in the flat morning light, not combustion smoke, coolant vapor. The specific color came from the nanocoolant compound, vaporizing on contact with the thermal shielding, a compound whose specification Elroy had contributed to in the 3rd phase of prototype development. He knew the color, because he had seen it in the testing environment every time a seal had failed under pressure and the nanocoolant reached the shielding before the system could compensate. He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the car and understood what was happening inside it with the certainty of a person who has studied a specific failure mode in detail and is now observing it in real time. The convergence junction of the secondary loop was fracturing. The coolant was leaking into the tertiary chamber. The thermal shielding was absorbing what it could, which produced the vapor. The diagnostic system was measuring pressure loss. When the loss crossed the threshold programmed into the warning protocol, a threshold that Elroy had argued in Memo XT447 was set too high, allowing too much loss before the alert triggered, which meant too much time elapsed before the operator knew there was a problem. The system would issue a critical warning. He had been right about the threshold being too high. He was looking at the proof. The drive door opened. Daniel Frost stepped out. Elroy knew who Daniel Frost was the way you know the names of the significant actors in your industry, not personally, just as a feature of the landscape. Mid-40s, gray suit, open collar. The founder and CEO of Nexus Techus, which had appeared on the cover of 4 engineering and technology publications in the past 18 months for its work on quantum computing infrastructure. He had his phone's ear and the expression of a man managing several simultaneous problems and finding none of them acceptable. He looked at the vapor rising from the vent panel, looked at his phone, looked at the car. He did not look at Elroy. Elroy started walking toward the car. He closed the distance to about 25 feet before Daniel registered him. The assessment that followed happened in under 2 seconds. Elroy had experienced this assessment enough times and 3 years to read its stages precisely. It started at the jacket, which was clean but had the particular worn quality of a garment that had been washed many times in public facilities. Moved to the backpack, moved to the overall picture of a man whose presence on this sidewalk at this hour did not correspond to any category of person Daniel Frost was expecting to encounter. The assessment concluded before it finished. Sir, Daniel's voice. Not unkind, exactly. Certain. The voice of a man who has determined the answer without examining the question. I've got this handled. Your secondary cooling loop has a fracture at the tertiary convergence junction, Elroy said. He kept his voice level. Informational, the way he would have said it in any technical meeting. The vapor from the right vent panel is nano-cocoolant, vaporizing on contact with the thermal shielding. Your diagnostic system will reach critical threshold in approximately 47 minutes. After that, the quantum stabilization bearings lose thermal regulation and fail. You are not looking at a repair at that point. You are looking at a full engine core replacement, 11 weeks minimum lead time. Daniel stared at him. Step back from the vehicle. The bearing alloy, Elroy said, requires specialized fabrication. 2 facilities in the country can produce it would. The lead time is not negotiable. It is not reducible by priority order. 11 weeks minimum. He paused. I can fix the fracture in under 20 minutes. I need you to let me do that. Something fractured in Daniel's certainty. Not a large break, just a hairline, the same kind of small flaw that was currently costing him a morning and about to cost considerably more. He looked at the vapor, looked at his phone, looked back at Elroy. Then he pressed the phone back to his ear and turned away. The crowd arrived, the way crowds always do, around something that has become worth watching. A woman from the marketing consultancy. 2 delivery drivers who stopped their route. A teenager on a bicycle who paused because everyone else had. Within 10 minutes, there were roughly 80 people on the sidewalk. Elroy stood at the outer edge of them and waited. He could hear enough of Daniel's phone calls to follow the situation. The manufacturer's service line, 2 hours estimated for a qualified technician. The diagnostic display visible through the windshield, critical threshold in 43 minutes. 2 hours and 43 minutes. The arithmetic was not complicated. Elroy waited with the patience that comes from having learned over 3 years that urgency is a resource and spending it carelessly produces nothing useful. The black SUV arrived at 12 minutes after Elroy's arrival. Tech Horizon security logo on the door panels. Victor Hale stepped out first. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his late 40s. Salt and pepper hair kept short, with the posture of someone who had been professionally responsible for doorways and perimeters for a long time. 2 personnel followed him. Hale surveyed the scene in the systematic way of someone trained to do it. Crowd first, car second, Elroy third. His expression settled into the neutral register of professional assessment, not hostile in any visible way, categorizing. A security professional's version of the same calculation that Daniel had run, reaching similar conclusions through a more practiced process. Mr. Frost? Hale addressed Daniel first. Always the principal first. Do you require assistance? There's a situation with the vehicle. Gestured in Elroy's direction without quite meeting his eyes. This individual claims knowledge of the problem. Hale turned to Elroy, looked at him directly. Sir, step back from the vehicle. I am 8 feet from the vehicle, Elroy said. I have not touched it. Step back from the immediate area. In 41 minutes, Elroy said, the diagnostic system hits critical threshold. After that, you have approximately 6 minutes before bearing failure. Your manufacturer technician is 2 hours out. I can fix this in under 20 minutes with what is already available here. I need you to let me work. Hale held his gaze, not angry, assessing. And you are? My name is Elroy Webb. I was lead thermal engineering consultant at Aerotech Industries. I designed the prototype cooling system this engine's architecture is derived from. The vulnerability I just described is documented in an internal Aerotech memo that I wrote and presented to the Engineering Review Board 3 years before this car went into production. Internal reference XT447. The silence that followed had texture. From somewhere in the gathered crowd, the involuntary sound people make when they encounter something too unlikely to categorize quickly. Not laughter, something adjacent to it. Daniel looked at Elroy with an expression that had moved past dismissal. Can you prove any of that?
Yeah.
He asked. Patent AT5772NIX, Elroy said. Filed 6 years ago. Primary inventor, Elroy M. Webb. The Helios cooling architecture is a modified derivative of that patent. The commercial version removed my attribution, but preserved the fundamental design. Internal memo XT447 documents the specific vulnerability I described. I wrote it and presented it in person to the Aerotech Engineering Review Board in a meeting that included Gordon Ashby, then Deputy President of Commercial Operations. At XT447, something moved across Daniel's face. Quick, there and gone. That reference was not public information. It had appeared in no litigation, no press coverage, no regulatory filing. It existed in Aerotech's document management system. Before Daniel could process this, Hale stepped closer to Elroy. Sir, this is your final warning before we contact law enforcement. Elroy looked at Hale, and here, in the second after he said Gordon Ashby's name, he saw something in Hale's expression that was neither the professional neutrality of before nor the expected escalation. Something older. A flicker of recognition that crossed the man's face and was controlled quickly. The way you control a reaction when you are in a professional context, and reaction is not something you have decided to show. Elroy noted it, could not yet interpret it. Set it alongside everything else he was tracking. He stepped back 2 feet, raised both hands, palms forward, the gesture that had become reflexive over 3 years. The physical grammar of I am not a threat, rendered without self-abasement, because he had also learned that performing fear was not the same as communicating harmlessness, and that the former cost something the latter did not. Call Dr. Sandra Merritt, he said. He addressed Daniel, not Hale. Space Tech Industries, Chief of Engineering. Tell her Elroy Webb is standing in front of a Helios apex with a secondary loop fracture and ask her what she thinks you should do. 1 call. You have approximately 39 minutes. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his contacts. He had Sandra Merritt's number because they had discussed a potential joint development project at an industry conference 14 months ago. The project had not materialized. He had kept the number because he kept all numbers. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Daniel Frost. Her voice. Elroy could hear it from where he stood, the distance just close enough. She sounded surprised. I didn't expect to hear from you. Sandra. Quick question. Do you know a man named Elroy Webb? Pause that followed was not the pause of someone searching their memory. It was the pause of someone stopping completely. Elroy Webb, she said. The name came out differently than the question had gone in, quietly, with the weight of something that had been held for a long time. Where did you hear that name? He's standing next to my car. He says he designed the cooling system the Helios Apex runs on. He's telling me the secondary loop has fractured. He gave me an internal Aerotech memo reference. XT447, Sandra said. Daniel went still. He wrote that memo, she said. Her voice had shifted from surprise to something more precise. The Helios cooling architecture is built on his patent, Daniel. Aerotech licensed it after he left. His name should be on that vehicle. It is not. If he is standing next to your car telling you the secondary loop has fractured, you need to listen to him. He is the most technically rigorous engineer I have worked with in 30 years. Put him on. Daniel lowered the phone, looked at Elroy. His expression had crossed some line that could not be uncrossed. The certainty was gone, and in the space where it had been was something more complicated. A man confronting comfort of having been badly wrong in a way that other people were present for. He held the phone out. Elroy walked forward and took it. Sandra. Her voice changed. Elroy, a beat, then, quiet. Tell me you're all right. I'm managing, he said. Right now I need you to tell him to let me work. Already done. A pause that was different from the others, not processing, not professional, personal. The specific silence of someone who has been worried about someone else for a long time and has just been given a data point that does not resolve the worry. We're going to talk. When this is finished, I mean that. I know you do, he said. I'll call you. He handed the phone back to Daniel, turned to face the car without waiting to see what Daniel's expression was doing. What do you need? Daniel said. His voice was different now. Not warm, not apologetic, direct. The recalibration complete, forward motion resumed. He was, whatever else he was, someone who could update and continue. Bolt 8B pencils, Elroy said, technical grade. 2 packs if available, and your emergency kit from the trunk. The pencils for the graphite, Daniel said. Not a question, he was working it out. The graphite particle density in a Bolt 8B pencil is specific enough to function as an infusion agent for the polymer sealant in your emergency kit. The combined compound has a thermal tolerance of approximately 390 psi at peak operating temperatures. The fracture needs to hold at 340 psi. That gives us a 50 psi margin. It is not a permanent repair. It will hold long enough for you to reach a proper service facility if you keep engine output below 70%. Daniel turned to one of Hale's personnel without hesitating. Hardware supply on Meridian. Bolt 8B technical pencils. 2 packs. He retrieved his key fob and released the trunk. Emergency kit is in the back. The personnel looked to Hale. A beat. Then Hale nodded once. The man went. Elroy set his backpack on the sidewalk, unzipped the front pocket, and removed 2 pencils of his own. He carried them always and assessed them. Adequate for the preliminary work. He would need the new ones for the primary application. The emergency kit was a carbon fiber case. Well, stuff. He opened it on the trunk lid and inventoried the contents with the efficiency of someone who had worked from emergency kits, often enough to know what he needed before he found it. Polymer sealant, adequate volume. Applicator set with a fine tip, mixing container vol small but sufficient. 2 specialized tools in the right pocket that would give access to the secondary loop panel without requiring the full disassembly the manufacturer's service protocol called for. He had thought about this specific repair in the abstract for 4 years. He had known it was coming. The model said it was coming. Yet he had not imagined he would be the one doing it. I'll explain what I'm doing as I go, he said to Daniel. Because you need the explanation. Because when this car goes to the service facility, you'll need to tell them exactly what was done. Daniel moved to where he could see clearly and nodded. The fracture is at the convergence junction between the secondary and tertiary loops, Elroy said. He pointed to a specific location on the forward undercarriage without touching the car. The vapor pattern along the lower casing edge tells me the fracture is vertically oriented. Coolant is draining south rather than pooling in the tertiary chamber. That's the favorable scenario. It limits contaminations significantly. He opened the small access panel on the right forward quarter. 2 screws, non-standard head, which the specialized tool it's addressed exactly. The panel came free. A faint hissing became audible as the pressure differential equalized. There, he said. He indicated the fracture with the applicator tip, not touching. In the morning light, with the vapor condensation pattern along its length, it was visible. A line so fine it might have been except for the behavior of the air around it. That, Daniel said, caused all of this. The system operates at sustained high pressure. A fracture at this location is a slow valve failure. The consequences compound over time. He looked at Daniel briefly. I identified this specific failure mode and this specific location in Memo XT447. The geometry of the junction creates a stress concentration point at peak thermal load. I recommended a reinforcing sleeve before production. Per unit manufacturing cost.
Approximate 3,000.
He said this without bitterness as data. As the record, Elroy took both packs. Opened one, selected a pencil, cracked the casing with the flat edge of the mixing container, and extracted the graphite core intact. He placed it in the container, added a measured amount of polymer sealant, and worked the 2 materials together with a small tool. constant pressure to break the graphite into particles that would distribute evenly through the polymer base. The mixing took 4 minutes. He did not hurry it. Particle distribution consistency mattered more than speed. When the compound was ready, he assessed it in the light. Even texture, correct viscosity. He pressed a small amount between thumb and forefinger. Resistance, right. Flow rate, right. "Stand clear of the engine line," he said quietly. The crowd stepped back without being asked twice. He applied the compound. This was the part that required the quality of attention that had no ordinary name. The fracture was less than 2 millimeters wide. The applicator tip was 0.8 millimeters. The compound needed to enter the fracture at an oblique angle to the pressure direction in order to seat correctly, so that when the system returned to operating pressure, the force would drive the compound deeper into the fracture rather than expelling it. One pass. There was material for one clean pass. He held the applicator without movement for 30 seconds after application, counting internally, waiting for the initial bond to begin setting in the ambient temperature, which was cool enough to slightly accelerate or cure. Then he applied the surface seal layer, feathered to the edges, replaced the access panel, seated both screws, stood up. "Start the engine," he said. Daniel was looking at the vent panel, which was no longer producing vapor. He looked at Elroy. "If it didn't hold," Elroy said, "you will know in under 30 seconds. We will still have time for a secondary approach." Daniel reached inside the car and pressed the ignition. The Helios Apex started. That low harmonic, that controlled, settled sound of a system running as designed. No catch in the secondary cycle. No variation in the 40-beat rhythm. Exactly right. The diagnostic display updated. Critical threshold warning cleared. New text. System stabilizing. Quantum thrust cooling nominal. Performance limit recommended 70% surface inspection. No vapor. The crowd noise rose in waves. Someone started it, and it caught. The spontaneous reaction of people who have witnessed something they will try to describe to someone tonight and find the description inadequate. Elroy stepped back, closed the emergency kit, set it on the trunk lid. 3 weeks under normal use without put caps at 70%, he said. Schedule factory service within 10 days. Tell them the access panel was opened and describe the compound. They will need to reseat the junction properly with manufacturer tooling. Daniel nodded. He was looking at the diagnostic display. Then at Elroy. He extended his hand. Elroy looked at it for a fraction of a second, then shook it. Daniel's grip was firm and held a beat longer than a transactional handshake. "I want to hear your story," he said. Elroy looked at him. A longer look's a simple acknowledgement required. The look of someone assessing the actual nature of a thing rather than its surface presentation. "It's long," Elroy said, "and it doesn't have an ending yet." "That's all right," Daniel said. "I have time." Elroy picked up the backpack, checked that the notebook was on top. It was. He followed Daniel to the car. Victor Hale was standing near the SUV. He had moved approximately 15 feet further from the Helios Apex during the repair. Gradually, each increment smallest enough unremarkable, the cumulative distance significant. He was standing with Hisens at his sides, looking at the middle distance in the way people look at nothing when they are actually looking at something they have not decided what to do with yet. As Elroy passed, their eyes met briefly. Hale did not look away in the defensive manner of someone managing a reaction. He looked directly at Elroy for exactly the length of time that a direct look requires before it becomes something else. Then he looked away. Not dismissal, something else. Elroy registered it without interpretation. He did not yet have enough information to know what it meant. The car door closed. The city moved past the windows. The morning continued, indifferent to what had happened on Meridian Avenue. In the backpack on top of everything else, the notebook with its dense handwriting and its 11 ideas on newspaper margins waited, as it had waited for 3 years, for the right moment to be relevant in ways that none of the people who would eventually care about it had yet imagined. The leather in Daniel Frost's car was the kind that had been worn in rather than new. soft with the warmth of something cared for over time. Elroy noticed this the way he noticed most things. Filed it without comment, sat with his backpack between his feet and his hands on his knees, and did not lean back into the seat. Daniel drove. The city moved past in that slightly unreal way it does when you are inside something expensive, smooth, frictionless, the world at a remove. Neither of Taux spoke for the first block and a half. Then Daniel said, "How long?" Not a question, the beginning of an accounting. 3 years on the street, Elroy said. Behind the machine shop on Carver, mostly. Shelter when there is space. Daniel absorbed this without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. His hands were steady on the wheel. He was a kind of driver who actually drove rather than managing a vehicle while doing other things. After Aerotech, he said. There must have been offers, there were approaches. So why? You need a permanent address to complete the onboarding paperwork, Elroy said. You need a bank account for direct deposit. You need a fixed address to open a bank account. You need a credit history at a fixed address for most banks to consider it. He watched the city pass. The misconduct allegation, retracted 18 months after the fact, was still appearing in background checks, not as a finding, as a flag requiring explanation. Most HR departments stopped turning calls at the explanation stage. The allegation was retracted, Daniel said. 18 months after it was gone, Elroy said, which is not the same as it not having existed. The industry has a long memory for accusations and a short one for corrections. That is not a complaint. It is an accurate description. They moved through an intersection. Morning traffic, ordinary. I took the original documentation to a lawyer, Elroy said. USB drive. The original memo and the modified version, both with timestamps. She confirmed they were substantively different at the points that mattered. She told me what it would cost to pursue it. And $80,000. Conservative estimate. Daniel said nothing. I had 412, Elroy said. The silence that followed had the specific quality of a man doing arithmetic he should have earlier, arriving at results that were obvious in retrospect and should not have required arriving at. What would you have done with it? Daniel said. If you'd had the funding, sued for patent attribution on the 3 inventions that I believe were filed under other names after I left, and for defamation based on the altered memo. He paused. I also would have fixed the secondary loop before the car was built if someone had listened. But that window closed 4 years ago. Daniel made a turn that brought them into the district where Nexus Tech's headquarters occupied an entire city block. 12 stories of dark steel and glass, a building that communicated its own success without explanation. Elroy had walked past it. He had retrieved journals from the recycling bins at its side entrance on Hamilton Avenue every Tuesday and Friday for nearly 2 years, which he had never been inside. The clothier stop took a place where the staff recognized Daniel before he reached the door, and where a charcoal jacket and dark trousers in Elroy's size appeared as if this were service they provided regularly. Because it was. The clothes fit well. They were the right weight and cut, and they made Elroy feel, briefly and without sentimentality, like the version of himself that had worn a conference badged to industry schwitz and presented at 2 of them. The stairs in the Nexus Tech lobby were different from the stairs on Meridian Avenue. Same stimulus. Different register. Recalibrating rather than dismissing. Claire Dunn met them at the elevator bank. She moved with the energy of someone managing many simultaneous priorities and had designed her approach to each day accordingly. She extended her hand to Elroy before Daniel introduced him. Claire Dunn, she said. Cedo. I heard about the car. News moves fast, Elroy said. Daniel texted from the clothier. She fell into step beside them. I've been looking at the patent record for the Helios cooling system since I got the text. My name isn't on the commercial version, Elroy said. She met his eyes directly. It should be. He held her gaze. Yes, it should. The investor meeting was on the 9th floor. When they entered the conference room, 8 of the 12 seats around the long table were occupied. Investors, from the look of them, the particular ease of people for whom expensive rooms have become the standard background of daily life. Elroy took the nearest to the wall, slightly back from the table. Observer position. He had been in enough rooms like this to know the geometry of authority and where to sit if you were not yet sure what role you would be playing. He scanned the table once and stopped. Third seat from the left. White hair, cut precisely. A suit that had moved past the stage of looking expensive and arrived at the other side, where it simply looked inevitable. The face of a man who had occupied positions of authority long enough that the bearing was structural rather than performed. Gordon's Ashby. Elroy recognized him not from a photograph but from memory. He had sat across from this face in the Aerotech Review board meeting 3 years before the prototype failure, 5 years ago now. 40 minutes in the same room, answers questions, watching that expressions of settled pre-decision. He had seen Ashby's signature set the bottom of the internal investigation report. He had associated the name with the face for 5 years. The face had aged in the way faces age when they have been in high-pressure environments for a long time. Not dramatically, just more firmly set, the features organize around a long habit of managing outcomes. Ashby looked up when Elroy walked in. Recognitions, immediate and immediately controlled. His face did not change in any visible way, but he looked at Elroy with the specific attention of a man who has seen something he was not expecting and is now deciding what to do about it. Then he looked away with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing what his face shows in professional settings. Elroy held the look for exactly long enough to establish that he had seen Ashby and knew exactly who he was. Then he moved his gaze to the presentation screen and left it there. He did not look at Ashby in the presentation. He was aware of Ashby looking at him throughout it. The presentation ran 40 minutes. Nexus Tech's thermal regulation system for quantum computing infrastructure, dissipation architecture for high-density quantum processor arrays. The engineering was genuinely strong on. The team had worked a real problem seriously. Elroy watched the slides and listened to the technical specifications and felt themselves in the design, arranged themselves in his mind, with the particular clarity of things that have an obvious shape once you understand the underlying physics. When Daniel opened the floor and looked at him, Elroy stood. He walked to the whiteboard, picked up the marker, looked at the diagram on the screen for 5 seconds. Your primary dissipation channel runs along the east face of the processor stack, he said. The manufacturing layout makes that the natural choice. But thermal load under peak quantum coherence is not uniform across the array. It concentrates at the northeast corner, approximately 17% above your base model projection. Your primary channel is undersized for actual peak conditions by a margin that produces compounding heat retention across extended operating periods. Design. Clean lines, no hesitation, the drawing of someone who already knows what the answer looks like. Bifurcated primary channel. Differential flow rate managed by a micro-valve array. Cost impact at manufacturing. Minimal. The components are in your existing supply chain. Efficiency gain under peak load, approximately 19%. Second diagram. Your secondary loop uses a polymer fluid with a phase transition at 340 degrees. Quantum coherence processors develop localized hotspots, reaching 380 degrees in abnormal operation. You have no designed response to that event. When the loop fails under those conditions, you lose coolant integrity and the processor array simultaneously. He drew the buffer configuration. 3 millimeters of aerogel composite between the secondary loop housing and the processor stack adds 6% to unit manufacturing cost. Eliminates catastrophic failure as an achievable outcome. Third diagram. Heat rejection to atmosphere through building Jagfeek integration works at your current testing scale at commercial deployment. A data center installation running 40 units. You are adding thermal load that standard building systems were not engineered to handle. You will generate host facility complaints within the first year and contract disputes within 18 months. He set the marker down. closed-loop liquid cooling on the heat rejection side. More complex at installation, the only architecture that scales. He stepped back from the whiteboard. Those three modifications increase your efficiency rating by approximately 34% at commercial deployment scale and remove your two primary failure modes. The core design's strong. The gaps are between the testing environment and actual deployment conditions. That is a common place to find gaps. He sat down. The room was quiet for an extended moment, not the polite quiet of people waiting for the presentation to continue, the different quiet of people rearranging. The investor in the second seat from the right, a woman in her late 60s, silver hair, the unhurried manner of someone who had sat through many presentations and had developed good judgment about what mattered, said, without raising her voice, "How long did that take you to see?" "About 30 minutes, Elroy said, reading the slide deck. She looked at Daniel. The look communicated a complete sentence without using words. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. Then carefully, "He fixed my car this morning with a pencil and an emergency kit." The woman looked at the corner of the notebook visible above Elroy's jacket breast pocket. "And that? That is something we will get to," Elroy said. Gordon Ashby stood up, slowly, deliberately. The unhurried tracks of a man for whom standing up in a room of people is a practiced act with understood meanings. "Before we continue," he said, measured, reasonable sounding, the voice of someone who had spent decades making the management of other people's situations sound like common sense. "I think due diligence requires us to understand our guest consultant's professional history more completely. There are unresolved matters relating to a prior engagement that I would believe the group should be aware of before proprietary technical discussions proceed further." He did not look at Elroy when he said it. He looked at the room. He was managing the room rather than addressing anyone in it. "Gordon," Daniel Seal said. His voice was flat. "I'm raising a governance question," Ashby said calmly. "It's a reasonable one given the circumstances. The unresolved matters, Mr. Ashby is referring to," Elroy said, addressing the room without raising his voice, "are the attribution of the Helios cooling patent to the commercial entity that licensed it rather than to its original inventor, and the modification of my safety report, Memo XT47, 11 days after my termination from Tech. A modification that altered the risk classification and removed the timeline recommendation that had been present in the original. Those matters are documented. The original memo exists with its original timestamp. I have carried it for 4 years. The room received this." Ashby's expression did not change. The specific stillness of a man who is assessing options while maintaining a surface of calm. Those are serious allegations that would require. "Daniel." Ashby turned to him, abandoning the room management approach for a more direct one. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess too." "We'll continue," Daniel said. "Gordon, sit down." The two words landed differently from everything else Daniel had said in the room. Ashby sat. He did not stop watching Elroy, and Elroy, without looking at him, was completely aware of it. The meeting ran another 50 minutes. By the end, every investor present had confirmed their commitment. 2 had increased their stake, specifically citing the thermal modification proposal. Daniel walked them to the elevator with the manner of a man who had expected things to go well. When the last investor had gone, the conference room held only Daniel, Claire, Elroy, and the specific quality of silence that follows when a room has been full of people and decisions and has now returned to itself. Claire had a folder on the table in front of her. She looked at it, then at Elroy. Then she opened it and set it in front of him. 2 pages, printed on Nexus Tech internal memorandum format, dated 18 months prior. Subject line: Patent Attribution Research, Helios Exothermic System, Primary Inventor Identification. The body was 2 paragraphs, cross-referenced analysis of the patent lineage of the Helios Apex cooling architecture. Conclusion: the primary inventor was Elroy Marcus Webb, formerly of Aerotech Industries. Current status: no fixed address. Last confirmed location: Westside District, based on shelter registration records, cross-referenced with public library card activity. At the bottom of the second page, reviewed. The initials DF. A date 18 months ago. Elroy read it once, then read it again with the precise attention he gave to technical documents where the details mattered. He set it down, his name, in clean corporate type. His complete professional history, summarized accurately. His current location, which meant someone had looked. Specifically, carefully, enough to cross-reference two separate systems to establish where he was. 18 months ago, someone at this company had known he was sleeping 2 miles from this building. He looked at the report for a moment before he looked up. There was something he needed to let himself register before he addressed it. Seeing his own name in that format, in that context, knowing that the information had existed and had not reached him, he let himself register it. Then he looked up. Daniel was looking at the table, not at Elroy. At the surface of the table, at the particular nowhere that people look when they know what is coming and are deciding how to face it rather than how to avoid it. You saw this, Elroy said. Yes. 18 months ago. Yes. What did you do with it? The silence was 4 seconds, the kind of 4 seconds that have weight and direction. Daniel looked up. His face held the expression of a man who has decided to stop managing and simply say the thing. Nothing, he said. One word. Then, I had a passive stake in Aerotech at the time. Not controlling, but significant. If your situation became public, the patent attribution, the memo modification, the liability exposure would have moved through the portfolio in ways I had calculated. He held Elroy's gaze. I estimated the impact at around $180 million. I told myself I would look into it when the timing was better. The timing never got better. I kept not looking. He did not add to this, did not frame it, or contextualize it, or append the implicit request for absolution that admissions of this kind usually carry. I was wrong, he said. There is no justification I can offer you, and I am not going to try to construct one. Elroy looked at him for a long time. He had expected the managed version, the sophisticated framing that acknowledges the fact while reducing its meaning. He had encountered enough of those in his career to recognize their structure in the first sentence. This was different. This was someone sitting down in front of the thing without building anything between himself and it. He picked up the report, closed it, set it to his left. Before I tell you what I'm proposing, he said, I want to show you something. He opened the backpack, removed the notebook, set it on the table. Daniel looked at it. May I? Elroy nodded. Daniel opened it to the first page and read, not skimming, reading, with the attention of someone who understood what he was looking at well enough to know it required actual attention. He turned pages slowly.
He went back twice.
He stopped for nearly 3 full minutes on the third entry. The cooling architecture for quantum neural network arrays, drawn in pencil on the back of a shelter meal program printout from 14 months ago, annotated in margins that had been added at different times as the idea developed. This addresses the thermal management problem for large-scale quantum neural processing, Daniel said. At scale, yes. If the material specifications for the composite buffer layer are achievable at production volume, which I believe they are based on the existing aerogel composite supply chain. How long have you been working on this? The foundational insight came in month 4 of my time on the street. The refinement has been ongoing. The version you're looking at is approximately 14 months of accumulated development. He paused. I had long stretches of uninterrupted thinking time. Daniel looked at him.
How many of these 11 ideas have already been filed by someone else?
The question was precise. He had already worked out the shape of the answer.
I don't have confirmation yet,
Elroy said. But I believe 3 of them connect directly to work product I generated at Aerotech before my termination. If someone had access to my documentation files after I left and filed applications based on the underlying concepts, then I've been developing these parallel without knowing whether the Aerotech versions had been filed by someone else. I have no access to the full patent database from the shelter library's connection. The subscription requires an institutional account. Daniel looked at Claire. She was already writing on her legal pad. Pull the comparison, Daniel said. Full analysis. The analyst who wrote the attribution report 18 months ago, Elroy said. She would have continued pulling the thread. Claire looked up. Anya Prather. She completed a second report 8 months ago. It has been in my review queue. She met Elroy's eyes directly. It cross-references your Aerotech documentation against 4 patent filings from the past 4 years. 3 of the files appear to be based on your work product. Without access to the Aerotech server records, we cannot confirm derivation definitively. But the technical correspondence is close enough that derivation is the most straightforward excision. The filing entity, Elroy said. 2 are under a Delaware LLC. Thornfield Applied Sciences. 1 is filed not directly. Thornfield meant nothing to Elroy, but the structure meant something. A Delaware LLC with a law firm registered agent was a structure designed to create distance between the filer and the filing, useful when you needed the filing to not lead directly back to you. Ashby is connected to Thornfield, he said. Claire's pause was an answer. The registered agent is a law firm he has used for at least 20 years, she said. The LC was formed 9 months after your termination from Aerotech. The first 2 filings were submitted 6 weeks after the LLC formation. 6 weeks. Someone had moved quickly on the 2 concepts that were most fully developed in the Aerotech documentation. At the time of his departure, El picked up the notebook from the table, found the 3 ideas he was thinking about, turned the notebook to face Claire and indicated them. Match these against the second report, he said. So specifically look at the buffer layer thickness specifications in the neural network entry and the flow rate parameters in the secondary management system. Those numbers are mine. They are not round numbers, and they are not derived from standard specifications. They came from a specific iterative process that is documented in my original Aerotech files. Claire looked at the pages carefully. Her expression shifted in the way. Expressions shift when information arrives faster than the vocabulary to accommodate it. Not dramatic. Just something more serious. She nodded once, closed the notebook gently, with the care of someone handling something that has established its own claim to careful handling. I'll have the legal team run the full comparison this afternoon and have results before your meeting with Daniel tomorrow morning. At the door, she stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, she said, and her voice was different from the CTO register she had been using. Quieter, more direct. I'm glad the car broke down on Meridian Avenue. She left. Daniel and Elroy sat with quiet that comes after a great deal of information has been introduced into a space, and before anyone has decided what the full weight of it means. Tomorrow morning, Elroy said, after you have Claire's results. Then we talk about what comes next. Of course, Daniel said. I'll have a room arranged at the Addison Street Hotel. Elroy nodded. He stood, picked up the backpack, replaced the notebook on top. At the door he paused, the analyst. Anya Prather, yes? Tell her the reports she wrote were read. Tell her specifically what they produced. He looked at Daniel. She put careful work into something and sent it into a system that did nothing with it. She should know that the work mattered. He left without waiting for a response. That evening, in room 4B at Shelter West Side, the class ran from 6 to 8 as it always had. Elroy stood at the whiteboard and taught thermal mass. What it was, why it mattered, why a cast iron pan retained heat for 15 minutes after the burner was off. He taught it using the objects in the room, which was how he had always taught. Raymond each one sharper than the last. Dee pushed back on one of Elroy's formulations in a way that required him to refine it. She was right to push back, and he told her so. Lena drew a diagram that was, in its essential structure, accurate. Afterward, when Raymond and Dee had left and Lena was gathering her things, she stopped at the door. You look different tonight, she said. Different how? She considered like something shifted, not happier exactly. Just like something that was suspended is moving again. He thought about this. Something like that, he said. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already worked out, and left. He walked back to the hotel at 9 solar, October night, cold enough to see his breath. His mind was turning over the gradient transitions problem Sandra Merritt had mentioned during their brief exchange that morning. The thermal cycling constraint in deep space insulation at the solar Chasteau boundary. He was aware in the particular way that awareness of connections happens, that the foundational structure of an approach was somewhere in the neural network coalescing system entry in the notebook. Different application. Same physics. He went to sleep easily for the first time, in longer than he could accurately recall. Victor Hales was in the lobby at 7:15 the next morning, not in uniform, not with personnel. Plain dark jacket, no badge, hands at his sides. The look of a man who had made a decision after a night of insufficient sleep and had come before he could revise it. Elroy was already there in the chair nearest the window, with coffee from the lobby station. He had been out since 5:30. The body did not consult the calendar. Hale walked toward him, stopped at 6 feet. "I'm not here in an official capacity," he said. "I can see that," Elroy said. Hale stood for a moment with the discomfort of someone competent in most situations who has arrived in one where competence is not the available tool. "I was at Aerotech 5 years ago," he said. "Contract security, executive protection. I was there the day your termination was executed." Elroy looked at him. "I was part of the escort team," Hale said. "Third position, blue jacket. Zach, I remember," Elroy said. Hale absorbed this. He had not expected Elroy to remember him. The fact that Elroy did remember shifted something in his posture, not destabilizing it, just adding weight to what he had already come to do. The framing given to security personnel was conduct violation and IP breach, he said. Standard language for a centralized company did not want to explain in detail. I executed the protocol. A pause. "I did not ask the questions I should have asked." "No," Elroy said. "You didn't. When I heard your name yesterday, what Dr. Merritt said about the patent, about the cooling system, I went home and looked you up. The original patent filing. The timeline of the prototype failure. The investigation report." He stopped. "The investigation report is not consistent with what I observed in that building in the period before your termination. The framing that was given to us was not consistent with the level of access control that was suddenly applied to your workstation 3 days before the termination was executed." He reached into his jacket, produced an envelope, held it out. "What's in it?" Elroy said. "A signed statement," Hale said, "dated, witnessed by my neighbor who is a notary at 6 o'clock this morning, attesting that the termination procedure I participated in was conducted under instructions that were, in my professional judgment, inconsistent with the stated cause, and that I was subsequently told by my direct supervisor that the stated cause had been his exact words, simplified for operational purposes." Elroy looked at the envelope. "This creates professional exposure for you," he said. "I am aware of that." "Why?" Hale zepped his eyes. The professional neutral was gone. What was underneath it was not guilt performance. It was something simpler and harder. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific piece of knowledge for a long time and has finally put it down somewhere that it belongs. "Because I was in that hallway," he said. "I executed a procedure I knew felt wrong. I put it in the category of not my problem and I walked away from it, and I have been in that category for 5 years. He paused. That category was wrong. It was always the wrong category. Elroy took the envelope. He held it without opening it. "That took something to do," he said. Hale shook his head once small. "It took 5 years to do. That is what it actually took." "Courage." 5 years. He turned and walked out of the lobby without waiting. Elroy watched him go, then looked at the envelope in his hand, then at the window, at the October morning, assembling itself outside the glass. He sat for a while with the envelope and the coffee and the early quiet. Then he went to find Daniel. The side office on the 8th floor was smaller than the conference room. 2 chairs, a low table, a window that faced the building's interior courtyard where the planted trees in the atrium below caught the morning light coming through the skylight. Daniel had chosen this room for this meeting, specifically. Elroy noted the intention behind the choice without commenting on it. He set the backpack on the floor, placed the envelope from Victor Hale, and the 2-page attribution report on the table between them. Daniel sat across from him. No phones visible, no coffee. The room stripped to what the conversation required. Before we discuss what comes next, Elroy said, "One question, all right. When you read the attribution report 18 months ago, one with my shelter registration and library card activity in it, what was the first thing you thought about?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at the report on the table. He was actually thinking about the question, rather than constructing answers to it, which Elroy noted. "The Aerotech stake," Daniel said. "That was the first thing. How quickly I calculated the liability exposure. It was within the first minute of reading." He looked up. "Then I thought about what it meant that someone with your background was in a shelter 2 miles from this building. That thought lasted maybe 30 seconds before I moved on to something else." A pause. "I've been thinking about these fake since yesterday morning." "What did you conclude?" Elroy said. "That 30 seconds was the moment I made a choice. I've been telling myself for 18 months that I didn't make a decision, that I just didn't act, which is different. It isn't different." Elroy looked at him. "No," he said, "it isn't." He placed the envelope beside the report. "Victor Hale brought this to me this morning," he said, signed statement. "He was part of the escort team for my termination at Aerotech. He has attested that the stated cause was inconsistent with what he observed in the building in the days preceding the termination, and that his supervisor told him the stated cause had been simplified for operational purposes." He watched Daniel's face. "He came on his own this morning." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Hale." "He went home last night and looked up the patent filing," Elroy said. "He made his own calculation, a different one from yours. Daniel did this without defense." "The patent comparison from yesterday," Elroy said. "What did Claire's team find?" Daniel reached to the side and picked up a folder that had been on the edge of the table. He set it in front of Elroy. Elroy opened it. 7 pages. Detailed, precise work. The product of someone who understood both the technical substance and the documentation requirements for what the comparison might eventually need to support. The header identified the analyst as Anya Prather. For each of the 3 ideas from the notebook, she had identified the corresponding patent filing, pulled the technical specification language, and run a side-by-side comparison against Elroy's original Aerotech documentation. The Aerotech records had been obtained through a preliminary request that the company had not yet formally responded to, but had not blocked. Apparently, they had made their own calculation about the cost of resistance. Elroy read the first comparison. The correspondence was close, not identical. The filings had been adjusted, language altered, diagrams redrawn. But the underlying technical architecture was the same structural approaches to the same problems, arrived at in the same sequence. The kind of similarity that could theoretically be independent development, except for the specific numbers. He turned to the second comparison. There, the buffer layer thickness. 17 millimeters. He had arrived at that number through a specific iterative modeling process at Aerotech. He had written the process in his lab notes. The number did not exist in the prior literature because the approach that produced it was his. It was not a round number. It was not derivable from standard specifications. It was the output of a specific set of decisions that were documented in his original files. The filing had 317 millimeters. He set the page down. He looked at the courtyard outside the window for a moment. The trees down there were beginning to turn, October light catching the early yellowing at the edges of the leaves. He sat with what he was looking at for a few seconds before he continued reading. This was the moment he had nodded, not the discovery itself, which he had suspected for months, but the confirmation. Seeing the number in print, his number, under someone else's name, in a filing that had been generating licensing revenue for 2 years, while he was developing the same idea again from on the backs of discarded paper in a public library. He finished reading the report. Then he closed it. 3, he had said. All 3, yes, said Elsie. The buffer thickness in the neural network entry. 17 millimeters. Prather Flagnet specifically. She said in her note that the number was unusual enough to be identifying. It is, Elroy said. It came from a modeling process that is in my original lab documentation. The number doesn't appear anywhere in the prior literature. He set his hands flat on the table. I want to tell you what I'm asking for, he said. 3 things in this order, not modified. Daniel waited. First, one finger. My name is restored as primary inventor on the 3 original Aerotech patents, not in a footnote, not in amended filing buried in the administrative record. Restored as primary inventor on the public record, with a formal correction notice to the patent office and a concurrent notification to the engineering press. Aerotech will need to cooperate. You have leverage. The liability exposure they are currently sitting on is significant, and they have already assessed that based on their cooperation with the preliminary records request. Yes, Daniel said. Continue. Second finger. The documentation of the memo modification goes to the engineering press. The original TIST timestamp, the modification timestamp, the server access log that identifies the modification origin, and Victor Hale's signed statement, not into a settlements agreement with a non-disclosure provision, published. People in this field made professional judgments about my character based on a record that was constructed after I was gone. That record needs a public correction on the record where those judgments were made. Daniel looked at him steadily. That creates a significant exposure for Tashbion's personally and for Aerotech. I know what it creates, Elroy said. I am asking for the second thing. A pause. Then continue. Third finger. Nexus Tech funds a fellowship. 12 positions per year, paid 12 months each, renewable on performance. For engineers and scientists whose careers were interrupted, termination under constitutive circumstances, medical interruption, incarceration, background check barriers. The selection does not use GPA, publication history, or employment continuity as criteria. Applicants submit a response to a technical problem, genuinely open-ended, no single correct answer, and whatever work product they have in whatever format was available to them. The evaluation is on how they think, not on what their resume looks like. He set his hands flat again. Those 3 things, not a directorship, not equity, not my name on your company materials. Those 3 things, and I will contribute the contents of the notebook and my time as technical advisor to the fellowship selection process. The room was quiet. Daniel looked at the notebook in the backpack beside Elroy's chair, then at the closed patent comparison folder, then at Elroy. The ideas in the notebook that are under dispute, he said. What is the conservative estimate of their value over a 10-year development horizon? I am not negotiating, Elroy said. I know. I am not either. I want to understand what you are offering in exchange for what you are asking. Elroy considered. Conservative estimate, depending one's reach production application and at what pace. 40 to 80 million in licensing revenue over 10 years. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. And you are exchanging that for 3 conditions. Patent restoration, a press disclosure to, and 12 fellowship positions per year. I am not exchanging it, Elroy said. The ideas are mine. They exist whether or not we make an arrangement. I am telling you what I want in exchange for my cooperation and my time going forward. The value flows from what I choose to do with the ideas, not from the ideas existing. Daniel was quiet. Then he said, all right, no counter-proposal. No modified version, no hedging toward a different number or different arrangement. All right, he said again. We move today. It's his hand across the table. Elroy shook it. Above the 2 documents that, between them, contained the record of what had been taken and the beginning of the accounting for it, the handshake held for a beaten then formality required. Gordon Ashby arrived at 10 o'clock. He came the way experienced operators when Sane sensed the ground shifting. Not summoned, but present, arriving before the room could organize itself without him. He had been at this long enough to understand that the way to influence outcomes was to be in the room where they were being determined, rather than to wait for the outcome to come to him. He walked into the 9th floor conference room and stopped when he saw Elroy. Saw the folder on the table, saw the notebook. His face moved through 2 adjustments in 3 seconds. The first was the managed expression, the face of a man who has decided what he is going to show in a room like this. The second was the recalculation, the face of a man registering that the situation is more developed than he had assessed. The third was what it settled into, and Elroy had not expected the third, a kind of fatigue. Old fatigue, the expression of a man who has been maintaining a specific events for a long time and is arriving at the point where the maintenance is no longer possible. "Gordon," Daniel said. "Sit down." Ashby sat at the far end of the table from Elroy. He looked at the folder. He did not reach for it. He looked at it the way you look at a verdict you expected. Claire set a second document in front of him, the patent comparison, the timeline, the LLC formation and filing dates, and stepped back. He looked at it, then at Elroy, and for the first time in 5 years, the two of them were in the same room with no managed framing between them and no outcome yet decided. "The technical correspondence in those 3 filings," Elroy said. "The buffer layer thickness, the flow rate parameters, the convergence geometry specifications. Those came from my lab documentation at Aerotech. They are in my original files. They are not in the prior literature. The only way they appear in filings submitted 9 months after my termination is if someone took my documentation after I left." Ashby looked at the comparison document. "There are scenarios," he said, "in which engineers working on similar problems independently arrive at." 317 millimeters, Elroy said. Ashby stopped. "That number," Elroy said. "It is in the filing. It is in the original labs, notes from 4 years ago. Explain the independent derivation of 317 millimeters. The room was quiet. "I want to know one thing," Elroy said. He kept his voice the same, level, informational, the voice he used for technical matters. "At the review board meeting where I presented Memo XT447. You read the memo before the meeting?" "Yes," Ashby said. "You understood the engineering." A pause. "Yes. You understood that the risk I was describing was real and probable." Ashby looked at the table. "Yes," he said. The word came about differently from the previous 2. Not managed, not positioned. The way things come out when the holding of them stops being possible. "And you chose to proceed with the launch." "The financial structure required it," Ashby said. "The penalty clauses in the pre-order contracts, the investor commitments that were tied to the timeline. I calculated those numbers," Elroy said. "They are on page 11 of the memo you read before the meeting. I put the repair cost next to the projected failure liability. You had both numbers. You chose the launch." Ashby was quiet. "You chose the launch," Elroy said. "And when the failure happened on schedule, you needed someone to have been wrong. The investigation report assigned the failure to inadequate risk communication. The memo that adequate risk communication was then modified to support that conclusion. 11 days after, I was no longer in the building to object it to the modification." He paused, and in the months after that, 3 concepts from my documentation files were filed under a different name through an entity you created 9 months after my termination. Ashby sat with this. "It was a series of business decisions," he said. His voice was quieter than before, not defending. More like reading something out loud that he had written a long time ago and was now hearing in a different context. Each one made sense at the time. "They made financial sense," Elroy said. "They made sense as long as the record supported them." He looked at Ashby directly. Daniel said, "Gordon, you have 2 choices. You cooperate with the Patent Office correction process and provide a signed statement confirming the timeline of the memo modification and your authorization of the document access and preceded my termination. In that case, the legal process stays civil. The disclosure goes through the press in a managed way with your cooperation as part of the record. Or you do not cooperate, and everything in that folder goes to the engineering press this week and to the district attorney's office for evaluation of whether the filing conduct constitutes fraud under federal patent law." Ashby looked at Daniel, then at Elroy, then at the folder on the table. "I'll need to speak with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Miss Daniels said. "You have until 5 o'clock today." Ashby stood. He was still the same man who had walked in. The posture, the suit, the practiced bearing of someone who had occupied positions of authority long enough that the bearing had become structural. But something in the architecture had changed. The weight of a specific maintained story, shifting into a different configuration now that the story could no longer hold its original shape. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around, he said. His voice was quiet, not performing, something that had been held for a long time and was now simply there without the container that had held it. I read it twice, the night before the review board meeting and the morning of. It was the best technical risk analysis I had seen in 10 years of review boards. He stopped. I knew that when I put it in the file drawer, he left. The door closed. The room held what he had said. Elroy looked at the closed door, then at the table, then at Daniel. He knew, Elroy said. Yes, Daniel said. That is the thing that costs the most, Elroy said. Not the launch decision, not the investigation report. The fact that I read it twice and knew it was correct and filed it away. That is the thing that is hardest to put somewhere manageable. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. They sat with it for a moment. Then Elroy opened the backpack, set the notebook on the table, and they began working. Claire came back at 11:15. Ashby's attorney called at 11:03, she said. She sat down and opened her legal pad. Full cooperation. Signed statement to the patent office by end of week. He is also prepared to provide a written acknowledgement of the timeline, the document access, the modification authorization for the press disclosure. Elroy nodded. Aerotech's general counsel called at 11:10. They completed their liability assessment apparently overnight. She paused. They are prepared to cooperate with the primary inventor reinstatement on all 3 patents. A correction notice to go out concurrently with the press disclosure. Timeline, Daniel said. Internal filing slot complete by Friday. Press disclosure goes out Monday morning. Engineering press and a concurrent release to the General's technology press. Daniel looked at Elroy. Does Monday work? Monday works, Elroy said. Claire looked at her legal pad, the fellowship. Walk me through the selection criteria. They spent 40 minutes on it. Not evaluation by resume. Not by publication history, GPA, or employment continuity. Those were the mechanisms that had already filtered out the people the fellowship was designed to reach. A technical problem genuinely open-ended, the kind with multiple defensible approaches. Submitted work product in any format. Evaluated on process. On how the applicant moved through the problem, what they chose to pursue and why, what questions they asked when the initial approach didn't resolve cleanly. Any format, Claire confirmed. Any format, Elroy said. Pencil on the back of whatever was available counts. I want the evaluation criteria written down explicitly, so there is no drift toward conventional presentation over time. 12 per year to start, Claire said, with a formal evaluation at year 3. The output will justify expansion. If it doesn't, we look at what we got wrong and correct it. You'll run the selection process for the first 2 years. Then I train whoever takes it over. I am not building a permanent role for myself. I am building something that works without me. Claire made a note. Your own work going forward. What do you need? A desk, Elroy said. Lab access 3 days a week. The materials lab if the scheduling allows. Meredith states at SpaceTech about the deep space thermal cycling problem she mentioned. I think the neural network architecture in the notebook connects to that problem in a way that might be useful. Claire looked at her list. The desk is on the 4th floor. Lab schedule I will have to you by Thursday. There are existing reservations, but I can work around them. I will reach out to Dr. Merritt's office today. She closed the legal pad. Then she said, Anya Prather. Yes, Elroy said. I am going to tell her this afternoon. Tell her specifically, Elroy said, not a general acknowledgement. Tell her that the attribution report she wrote 18 months ago and the follow-up 8 months ago are the direct foundation of the correction process. Tell her what the corrections are. She put careful work into something and sent it into a system that did nothing with it for 18 months. She should know exactly what her work produced. Done, Claire said. She left. Daniel and Elroy sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. The notebook, Daniel said. The 8 ideas not under dispute. When does she want to start on the write-ups? I will have the first one ready in 3 weeks, Elroy said. The neural network cooling system. Specifications, material requirements, proposed development pathway. He thought for a moment. The deep space application may actually be the faster path to production. If Sandra's team has the manufacturing infrastructure for the composite materials, the timeline to prototype is shorter than the computing application. Then start there if that's where the opportunity is, Daniel said. Elroy nodded. He stood, picked up the backpack. The notebook went back in on top. Send me the press disclosure draft before it goes out, he said. I want to review the technical language. Of course, Daniel said. At the door, Elroy stopped up. He turned back. The fellowship name, he said. I don't want it named after anyone. Not a donor, not an institution, not me. He paused. Name it for what it does. The Technical Reentry Fellowship or something close to that. Something descriptive. Something that tells the people it is meant for exactly what it is. Daniel looked at him. Done. Elroy left. He saw Sandra from the lobby. She picked up on the first ring. I was waiting, she said. Since yesterday morning, I know. He found a chair near the window and sat. Sandra, the deep space thermal cycling problem. The insulation layer at the solar shadow transition gradient. You've been thinking about it since yesterday. The neural network cooling architecture. The approach to gradient transition management. I think the same structural logic applies at the space environment scale. Different materials, different pressure conditions, but the same underlying physics. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from the refrigerator she had been holding. Elroy, before we talk about the engineering, I need to say something. He waited. When Daniel called me yesterday and said your name, she said, I had been looking for you for 2 years. I sent a message to the shelter system 18 months ago through a social services contact. It apparently did not reach you. I was not consistently registered, he said. I moved between the shelter and other locations. I should have done more. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the steadiness of someone making an effort. You were gone, and I knew something was wrong, and I did not do enough to find out what. You didn't know where to look, Elroy said. I should have looked harder. A pause. I'm sorry, Elroy, not a formal apology. Just, I'm sorry, I missed you for 3 years and that mattered. He sat with this. You're the only person who has said that, he said. Missed. Not apologized for the professional situation or the documentation. Just said that missed me. Well, Sandra said, and her voice had a different quality now, something that might have been the beginning of a life if it'd gone differently. You were the most interesting person I worked with, and then you weren't there anymore. And that was a significant loss. I've been developing ideas and a composition book with electrical tape on the spine, Elroy said. I know, she said. Daniel told me. I want to see all of it. A beat, the gradient transition problem. Tell me where you are with it, he told her. They talked for 45 minutes. It was the kind of conversation that had been the best part of working in the field. 2 people who understood the same physics working toward the same problem from different angles. Each one's formulation sharpening the others. By the end of it, they had sketched the outline of a collaborative approach that neither of them had had before the call. 2 weeks, he said. I have a few things to finish here, then I'll come. To you. 2 weeks, she agreed. I'll have the team ready. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the lobby chair. The atrium trees were visible through the glass panel beside the elevator bank. The ones planted in raised beds under the skylight, whatever species they were that had been chosen for interior light conditions. He had walked past this building for 2 years. He had not known the trees were there. He picked up the backpack and went out. He had somewhere to be. Room 4B at Shelter West Side. The class was in 4 hours, and he needed to stop by first to check the marker. He had a spare in the backpack, had been carrying it for 3 weeks. And he wanted to do that before the afternoon rather than arriving at 6 and finding the board equipment in the state it was usually in. He walked the 2 blocks out of his way without reconsidering it. They were his blocks. He knew the sidewalk cracks. He knew the smell of the bakery at the far end. He had walked this route more times than he could count, and would walk it many more times going forward, and that was not consolation for anything. It was simply what was true. The shelter's front entrance was unlocked during the day. He went in, down the main corridor, past the common room where 2 residents were watching a midday program at low volume, left at the junction, down the secondary hall to room 4B. He unlocked the door, turned on the light. The fluorescent tube at the near end of the ceiling fixture was still flickering at its own particular irregular rhythm. He had mentioned this to the coordinator twice. He would mention it again. Institutional maintenance had its own timeline. He uncapped the whiteboard marker, drew a line on the lower corner of the board. Faint, nearly gone. He took the spare from the backpack's front pocket, uncapped it, set it in the marker tray, capped the old one, and put it in his jacket pocket to dispose of properly. He looked at the whiteboard. The thermal mass equation from last Thursday's session was still in the upper right corner where the eraser hadn't reached. Raymond's handwriting. Elroy had let him work through the last problem himself, standing at the board with the marker, which was how he had always believed people learned things that stayed. He picked up the new marker, tested it. Clean, dark line. He looked at the equation for a moment, then picked up the eraser and cleared the board completely. Set the marker back in the tray. Set the eraser in its place beside it. Stood in the empty room for a moment. 3 years. Not corrected, not reversed, not erased by a good morning on Meridian Avenue, and a meeting where things had gone the right direction. 3 years of what they were. The compounded output of systems that had no mechanism for what they encountered when they encountered Elroy Webb, applied to his specific sick life with specific precision, producing a specific result that would take considerably more than 1 morning to fully account for. On Monday, his name would be restored on 3 patents. In the weeks after that, the press disclosure would go out and the record in the industry would be corrected, not completely. Because records are never completely corrected, but corrected enough that the people who needed to see the correction would see it. In the spring, 12 people with interrupted careers and intact minds would receive letters describing a fellowship that had been built without announcement for exactly the situation they were in. And on Thursday evening and Saturday evening and next Tuesday evening, room 4B would hold whoever came, and the whiteboard would have a functioning marker, and the thermal dynamics of pipe joists and circuits and flow rates would be explained using the objects in the room, because that was how Elroy had always believed things were best taught. Starting from what was already there, already present, already real. He had not stopped because no one was watching. He had not reduced what he was because the systems around him had required it. The reduction had been applied to him from the outside, consistently and without malice, by policies and calculations and 30-second decisions to file things under not my problem. It had taken everything external that could be taken. It had not taken the notebook or the thinking or the Tuesday evenings. Those had continued. That was the thing, finally. Not the patent restoration, not the press disclosure, not the handshake across the table. The thing was the continuation itself, the fact that there was still something to restore, because he had not allowed himself to become something that required restoration from the ground up. The patent process would formalize what was already true. The fellowship would create the infrastructure for what was already possible. The work Sandra would follow from work that had already been done, in pencil, on discarded paper, by a man sitting in a public library because it was the warmest place available without cost. He turned off the light, locked the door, walked back down the corridor, past the common room, out into the afternoon. October. Cold enough now that the breath was visible, so the sky a clear pale gray that would be dark by 5:30. The city was doing its mid-afternoon operations. Different from morning, different from evening, the particular cadence of the hours between. He had the call with Sandra's assistant to confirm the scheduling. He had the lab schedule coming from Claire on Thursday. He had the press disclosure draft to review when Daniel sent it. He had the notebook entry on the neural network cooling system to expand into a full technical write-up, which he would to start tomorrow morning in the library the way he started everything. Notebook open, problem arranged. The particular quality of silence before the first line is drawn. He had room 4B at 6 o'clock. He started walking, not toward the hotel, not toward anything that required a decision, toward the library, because it was where he went when he needed to think, and movement helped the thinking. He would walk the 2 miles, and somewhere in those 2 miles, the next part of the gradient transition approach would clarify itself, because it is always clarified in movement, and then he would sit at his usual table with the journal he had found that morning, and the notebook open beside it. And the afternoon do what afternoons do when you have work to do in them. The city moved around him. He moved through it. The notebook was on top of the backpack, inside the main compartment, where it had been every day for 3 years, where it would be in tomorrow, where it would be the day after that. The name on the blueprint had always been his. Now the blueprint would say so. He walked